name's Ketevan. Welcome back to my channel. I am super excited because this month Invisible Cities has chosen South Africa as one of the countries that we'll be reading from. And as I used to live in South Africa, it's very near and dear to my heart, and I also have a lot of books about and set in South Africa and written by South African authors. So I thought actually today I'd start with nonfiction reads. I know typically we read literature for Invisible Cities, although that's not a requirement, but I thought that some nonfiction reads might be interesting, mostly because they're on my shelf and I'm going to share them with you because I want to, but also because I think, for me at least, it's very helpful to have some sort of nonfiction background when I'm reading literature from a certain country. And of course, most of the time I don't have time to read a whole nonfiction book about a country, so I end up reading a Wikipedia page or a brief summary online. But since there is so much available about South Africa, and like I said, I have them on my shelf, I thought I'd share some with you. And I know you're probably thinking like, oh yeah, I know about South Africa, the apartheid movement, things like that. And you're right, you probably do know more about South Africa than any other African country. So perhaps you don't really need to read a nonfiction book about South Africa, but I'm here anyway to tell you all about these options. The first one I recommend to almost everybody, I can't think of a person where I think they wouldn't enjoy this. It's a memoir called Born a Crime, and it's by Trevor Noah. He is probably the most famous South African comedian in the world. He hosted a late night show in the US for quite a few years, and he's quite funny. I do enjoy his comedy, but this memoir is a bit more serious. It is funny in tone. He's a comedian. It's lighthearted. It's not too depressing, but of course parts of the story are quite sad, poignant, and depressing, but he keeps it very light throughout the whole book. Even during the most horrible scenes, he still has this like wonderful tone that keeps it lighthearted, even if it's not funny. It's called Born a Crime because he was born to a Xhosa mother who's black, and his father is white and from Switzerland. So at that time, pre-1994, during apartheid, mixed marriages and were not legal. They weren't married, but having a baby with a white parent and a black parent usually would have resulted in the child's removal, and that child would have been placed into a colored family. So colored is, not a polite term in the United States, but in South Africa, it's a term for people who are descended from mixed-raced people. So it's a separate cultural group. They speak Afrikaans usually. What apartheid was trying to do is to sort of disencourage mixing of the races, of course, and so they would just take the mixed-race child and place it in a colored family, and then it would sort of like you'd stay with who you look like. And so of course threat of child removal was always present if people found out that he was mixed race. So his childhood was often spent hiding from people, and of course like people close to him knew, and he was able to go to school and everything, but it was definitely sort of like a pressure on his life that I think most children do not have. So he writes from that perspective, and then also he gets into like the normal parts of boyhood and adolescence and growing up and during this very like strange time in South Africa. What I really love about this book is that it is actually a book kind of dedicated or a love letter to his mother. And most people don't mention that when they're talking about this book, which I find so strange because that's kind of the crux of the book almost, at least for me when I was reading it. And it is really just he just honors his mother so much. Like he really believes he is who he is because of his mother. And that's something that South Africa, I think, does very well, honoring mothers. There's an entire national holiday dedicated to women, which is a celebration of women marching in the anti-apartheid movement. And that's a national holiday to this day. So I really think this is a nice way to sort of like gently learn a little bit about South Africa, being entertained and learning a little bit more about a famous person. It's really great. I also highly recommend the audiobook because he narrates it himself. And then while we're on to memoirs and biographies, why not dive straight in to the classic itself? I'm sure you all know who Nelson Mandela is. He's probably the most famous African ever in the history of Africa, at least to our modern sensibilities. So he, if you don't know, is the former president of South Africa and was one of the main leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. So this is quite a chunker of a book. It is very long. It is dry in some parts. I will admit that. It is definitely like a full accounting of his life from his boyhood all the way, I think, up until just before he became president, I want to say. So it's not about his presidency. It's about like kind of the anti-apartheid movement and how his life led him to being that leader. And of course, he didn't do everything by himself, but he's often given the most credit because he was sort of the face of the movement. And he also was imprisoned for many years, decades, I believe, Yeah, or he was imprisoned for over 25 years, still managed to be the leader of a movement. I do think it's important to read this just because, you know, the history of South Africa is quite different to most other African countries, and it's largely because of this movement and him and his compatriots' actions and, you know, their commitment to making it a peaceful transition, to take power away from the oppressive white government. However, what I think is really powerful about this book is that he is quite transparent about the fact that he would like a peaceful transition. He wanted a peaceful transition, but he was not opposed to using terrorism in escalating gradations in order to achieve his goal, because his goal was to free his people because they were being extraordinarily oppressed by a foreign invasion. The white government, all white people in Africa are foreigners. You know, he knew that that was more important than a peaceful transition that took 40 years. So he wasn't above using those methods if necessary. Luckily, because I think partially because he and his compatriots were very skilled at what they were doing, and they, you know, used the foreign media and there was pressure from the rest of the world. They were able to do a peaceful transition. But I think it's really important to know that a Nobel Peace Prize winner is not above violence. and I think that's a very interesting conversation and an interesting thing to think about, because what is peace? And to me, peace is not just a lack of physical violence. Peace is prosperity and equal opportunities for all, and maybe not even equal, but equitable opportunities. So anyway, very interesting conversation. It's not a big topic in the book, obviously. The whole book is about his life, but he does discuss this in the book. And I think learning more about this man will help you, you know, rethink some of your beliefs maybe, or rethink some of the assumptions about South Africa itself, or how peace processes need to look in Africa and elsewhere. So anyway, highly recommend, very good. Audiobook version as well. I think if you tried to read this on paper, it would be a little too dry. So I think the audiobook is really well narrated. The accent is perfect. The audiobook narrator is not South African, but the accent, unbelievably accurate. Like, wow, I was really impressed. So, speaking of very influential figures, if I were to say that Nelson Mandela was the most popular or well-known African person, I would have to say also Desmond Tutu might be a very close number 2. This is very glossy, so I'll try to like hold it at the right angle. So I have not actually read this book, and the book I'm missing from my stack, and I don't know where it is because I thought I had it here, is another book by Desmond Tutu, and it's called no, this is No Future Without Forgiveness. The other one is called God is Not a Christian. And so he talks about, because if you don't know, Desmond Tutu is a archbishop in, I believe, the Anglican Church. Yeah, sure. And he also is a Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize winner. He, in that book, discusses that Christianity is a concept invented by man. It is not anything intrinsic to God. You know, religions and leaders, especially of churches and other organizations, will often say, you know, like, oh, the Pope is, you know, God on the planet or whatever they say, blah, blah, blah. But he's talking about like, what is a real Christian? A real Christian loves people and wants peace and happiness for everyone. And it is not about church politics. It is not about power. It is just about making the world a better place. And so as a Christian, I find it super, super powerful, his work in that book. And it's a really good reminder that it kind of just warms my heart when I read his works. I think he's since passed away, but he is the kind of presence we need in the world to remind us of why we're here and what we're actually doing. So this book, No Future Without Forgiveness, is the other pick by him. I should probably pick it up soon because I know I'm gonna love it. But if you're not aware, South Africa, part of the reason why it was able to be such a peaceful transition in 1994 is because they set up something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Desmond Tutu was named by Nelson Mandela as the chair of that commission, specifically to try to heal the wounds that were existing between Black and white people primarily. Of course, other groups were involved as well. You know, there's a large Indian population, and also, like I mentioned earlier, the colored population. But in general, it was white people had harmed Black people and colored people as well. And there was a lot of pain there, obviously. And so to sort of avoid violent backlash, they really wanted to sort of try this new process. And basically I'm really glossing it over because we don't have time in this video, but it's basically that if a white person knew they had done something wrong, and usually viciously wrong, like raping, murdering, dismembering type of wrong. This is not like a casual, you know, microaggression of racism. They would register themselves with the commission, share the name of the person or people usually that they had murdered, where their bodies were buried, things like that. And then that person's family was able to know where they were because, of course, these people were just marked as missing. It's not like, you know, the bodies had been found because they were often in unmarked graves, and the government wasn't keeping track of these things at the time. It was a really good opportunity for families of the people who had been murdered or harmed in some way to get closure, and also to give them the opportunity to forgive the person who had done it. And you might think to yourself, someone, you know, dismembered my family member and put them in an unmarked grave, I wouldn't be forgiving them. But, you know, shockingly, thousands and thousands of people did. They really, both sides really, I wouldn't say enjoyed the process, but took well to the process. And I think that is given most of the credit for the peaceful transition in South Africa. So this book goes into more, I think, of the nitty-gritty of why admitting wrongs and apologizing and, you know, repairing the harm is the only way forward. You can't just pretend things didn't happen and just sort of like, oh, we're just gonna forget about it, and then after a few generations it'll go away. Now we know the science is there, things don't go away, they get passed down genetically, and also, of course, it's just not right to pretend you didn't do horrible things. So I would really highly recommend this one if you're interested more in that process. It's since been applied in Rwanda and also in other, not national contexts, but in general, like more community-based, and it's, I think, been proven quite effective. So interesting book there. And then I guess the next one, logically, would be Gangtown by Don Pinnock. Don Pinnock is a white South African sociologist and journalist, I believe. Oh no, he's a criminologist and journalist. And so he is basically writing in this book a very, very detailed examination of the gangs of Cape Town. I think, maybe not now, but in the past, Cape Town has been quite famous because it had the highest number of murders for many years. That is still the case, like lots of murders happen in Cape Town, but it's very much still a segregated city, and those murders are almost exclusively due to gang activity and by gang proximity. So if you live near gangs, you might become a victim, but it's random. It's very rare that, you know, well, no, I won't say it's rare, but it's less rare than you might think in other areas of the city. However, it's still a huge problem, so I don't want to downplay that. But he goes into depth about sort of why gangs emerged, and mostly it's because of a lack of masculinity rituals. So when boys become men, you know, Jewish boys, they have their bar mitzvah, and that's like their ritual and their ceremony. They're celebrated by the community or a man now. And, you know, we think of it, I think, often as these types of things like, oh, this is a chance to get presents. But those kind of rituals are actually really important to human development and integration into the community. And so without those rituals that had been stripped away by colonization and the oppressive apartheid government, without these rituals, people needed an alternative something. So specifically for boys, gangs started to form. And then as apartheid lasted so long and there was no sort of like intervention or anything like that, it just became this like very oppressive force. And now the gangs in Cape Town are quite powerful, and it's one of those things where it's like, it's so big now, we don't even know how to get rid of it. But why I really appreciate this is, well, of course, it gives lots of detail about South Africa in particular, and of course, Cape Town even more specifically. It really does sort of draw on this larger sociological trend of what happens when we don't have ritual, and how communities and other alternative rituals will create themselves if there isn't anything more positive in its place. So I really recommend this one if you're interested in the crime of South Africa. Now, this next book is going to follow into our criminology theme, and it's called Rape, a South African Nightmare by Phumla Dineo-Gola. And so this one I actually picked up while I was living in South Africa. I went to a talk by the author. I did not read it at the time though, because I was working in this field and I did not want to work all day in this field and then go home and read more about it. Unfortunately, for my spirit at the time, I did not have it in me, so I never picked it up, and I might pick it up at some point, but it's still a very heavy topic. So, but this I think is a very important companion piece to, say, for example, if you're reading Coetzee's what's that book called? Disgrace. J.M. Coetzee is a Nobel Literature Prize winner, and that's his most famous book. And it's about basically, well, it's about a lot of things, but one of the things discussed in the book are the white farm rapes that happen in South Africa. So Black men will go to rural farms where white people own the farms and rape the women. And if you read that book, it's a great book literature-wise, and though that issue is an important issue, but it might give you a very one-dimensional view of what rape is in South Africa, because that is not it. That represents a very small proportion of the rapes and sexual assaults that happen in South Africa. You might walk away from that book thinking it's not as small of a proportion as it actually is in reality. So this is the kind of book I think that would round out that understanding of rape culture in South Africa. So I won't get too much into the details, but what I'll say is there's a lot of specific aspects of South African rape culture in particular that are maybe not unique, but to anywhere in the world, but definitely unique to South Africa. So highly recommend this one. You know, the author is a very well-known feminist, South African feminist, and this book is very, very well regarded by everyone who's read it. And then last but not least, I actually am not sure what this book is about. I just picked it up off the bookshelf because I know it's about South Africa, but this is actually not my book. It's my husband's book. And it's called The Other Side of Freedom, Stories of Hope and Loss in the South African Liberation Struggle from 1950 to 1994. This was a gift that he was given by a South African friend as a going away present. And I believe he hasn't read it. I think he maybe has flipped through it and read pieces of it because it's quite dense, but it's in article or part format, so I think it's easier to sort of pick up here and there. But essentially, I think these are sort of just kind of like mini memoirs of all the people, or not all the people, but it's a selection of the people that worked in the liberation movement. Because most of the people, if not all, I think, are actually less well known. They're not like famous people that would have their own books. So these are sort of like the everyday person who might have played a role, but it's not like anyone's gonna make a movie about their life kind of people. And those people are the most important people of any movement. Leaders are important, but without people to lead, leaders can't really do much. So I think this kind of story or book might be very interesting as well for those looking to learn more about the anti-apartheid movement. So that's that. That's the last recommendation, I promise. I hope you've found something that maybe you might want to pick up for this month for South Africa or in the future. And if you have any good nonfiction recommendations about South Africa, I'd love to hear them. So please share them below in the comments. And until next time, bye.